Was elbow deep in a broken hydraulic line on a CH-47 when my phone buzzed against the concrete floor of the hangar at Bagram. I ignored it the first time. The second time, I wiped the grease off my hands on my flight suit and picked it up. My buddy Reese was standing 3 feet away watching my face, and he later told me he knew something was wrong the second I went quiet. It was my wife's number, but it wasn't her voice. It was my daughter. Daddy. That was all she said. Just that one word in a voice so small and so wrong that my whole chest caved in. 7 years old, and she sounded like she was calling from the bottom of a well. Rosie. I stepped outside the hangar into the cold Afghan air. Rosie, baby, where's Mommy? Mommy's sleeping and she won't wake up, and there's a lot of blood on her face, and I don't know what to do, Daddy. I don't know what to do. I don't remember walking back inside. I don't remember handing Reese the phone or telling him what she said. I just remember the next 4 hours being the longest of my life, and I was an Army combat controller who'd done 2 tours in Helmand and 1 in Mosul. I knew what fear felt like. This was different. This wasn't the fear of dying. This was the fear of the wrong person dying. My wife's name is Laurel. She's 31 years old, teaches 2nd grade at Jefferson Elementary in Harkers Mill, North Carolina, and she drives a 2019 Subaru Outback with a cracked passenger side mirror she keeps meaning to fix. She is the most careful, most decent person I have ever known. She doesn't speed. She doesn't drink more than a glass of wine at dinner. She calls her mother every Sunday and keeps a first aid kit in the glove compartment and always wears her seatbelt. None of that mattered the night of October 14th. I found out the details in pieces over several calls, through Reese and then through our neighbor Diane. Not the one in the file, a different Diane. Our actual neighbor, and then finally through a deputy named Hollis at the Carteret County Sheriff's Office who sounded bored when he told me what had happened to my wife. Laurel had been driving home from school at 5:40 in the evening. Rosie was in the back seat. They'd stopped at the Piggly Wiggly on Route 9 for milk and cereal, and were heading home on County Road 7 when a cruiser lit her up about a mile past the Texaco station. She pulled over. She turned off the engine. She rolled down the window. There were 2 of them. Deputies. One named Spence, one named Allgate. She didn't know their names then. She learned them later. I learned them later. I wrote them down on a piece of paper and folded it and put it in my breast pocket and kept it there for 6 weeks. What happened next, I've had to piece together from Laurel's account, from Rosie's account, and from what little the department admitted to in its own internal report before that report was quietly buried. Spence told Laurel her brake light was out. It wasn't. That was established later by a mechanic and by dashcam footage from a gas station 200 yards back that neither deputy knew existed. Laurel told him she hadn't had anything to drink. He told her she smelled like alcohol. She told him she'd had a Diet Coke at the school staff meeting. He told her to step out of the car. She stepped out. Rosie was watching from the back seat. What happened over the next 11 minutes is something I cannot fully describe in language that is appropriate to the situation, and I'm going to be honest with you. Writing this down is the first time I have tried to put it in order, and I keep having to stop. Spence grabbed her arm when she asked what she was being detained for. Allgate was already behind her. She tried to turn and ask them to please lower their voices because her daughter was in the car. Spence took that as resistance. He took her arm and yanked it behind her back, and when she cried out, Allgate pushed her face first into the side of the Subaru. Her cheekbone shattered against the doorframe. She went down. Rosie started screaming inside the car. Spence kicked Laurel twice while she was on the ground. Allgate stood over her and told her to stop resisting. She was not resisting. She was trying to breathe. They called it in as a DUI with physical altercation. They filed a report that said she had struck Spence in the face, which left a mark he put there himself. They left her on the shoulder of County Road 7 until the ambulance came. They did not check on Rosie. My 7-year-old daughter sat in that back seat for 22 minutes, alone, while her mother was on the ground 10 feet away and no one touched that door handle. A passing driver stopped and sat with Rosie through the window. I don't know who that person was. I wish I did, because I would like to thank them for the one decent thing that happened that night. I got emergency leave approved in 43 minutes, which is a record, and Reese drove me to Bagram himself at 0200 and waited with me until my flight came through. He didn't say a lot. He's not a talker. He put a coffee in my hand and sat next to me, and when I finally said, I should have been there, he said, you were where they sent you. That's different. I landed in Charlotte at 6:15 p.m. the following day. My mother-in-law had Rosie. I went straight to Carteret Regional Medical Center. Laura was in a room on the 2nd floor. Her face was wrong in a way that I had seen on other faces before, in other countries, and I had to stand in the doorway for a moment before I could walk in because my legs were doing something I didn't have control over. Her left cheekbone was fractured in 2 places. She had a broken rib, 3 bruised ribs, a laceration above her right eyebrow that had been closed with 8 stitches. Her left eye was swollen shut. She was awake when I came in. She turned her head toward the door, and when she saw me, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to hold itself together, "Don't look at me like that." I said, "Like what?" She said, "Like it's your fault." I sat next to her bed and I held her right hand, the one without the IV, and I didn't say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was not appropriate for a hospital room. I went to the sheriff's department the next morning. I was in civilian clothes. I was calm. I had learned a long time ago that calm is more useful than loud. The desk sergeant told me the incident was under internal review. He said Deputy Spence and Deputy Aldgate were on administrative leave pending the investigation. He said this in a tone that communicated very clearly that administrative leave was a formality and that the investigation would conclude the way these investigations tend to conclude. I asked to speak to the sheriff. The sheriff's name was Beaumont. He was in his late 50s, had a belt buckle the size of a dessert plate, and shook my hand with the practiced warmth of someone who runs for office regularly. He thanked me for my service. He told me the department took all complaints seriously. He told me the deputies in question were good men who may have made a judgment error in a high-pressure situation. I said, "My wife is in the hospital with a fractured cheekbone. My daughter sat alone on the side of the road for 22 minutes. He said, "I understand your frustration." Those were the 4 words that told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. I called my older brother that night. His name is Kane, and he is the one person on earth who has known me long enough to understand what my silence means. I told him what the sheriff said. I told him what Laurel looked like. I told him about Rosie sleeping in my mother-in-law's guest bedroom with the nightlight on, because she wouldn't sleep in the dark anymore. Kane said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to know what's actually going on with these 2. Kane has a particular set of skills that don't belong in this story and that he would prefer I not detail. What I will say is that within 72 hours he had given me more information about Deputies Spence and Aldgate than the sheriff's department would willingly produce in 5 years of litigation. Spence had 2 prior excessive force complaints, both closed without finding. The first complainant was a black man named Terrence from Beaufort who'd had his wrist broken during a traffic stop in 2019. The second was a woman named Gretchen who'd been stopped on Route 41 in 2021 and described being shoved against her car by someone matching Spence's description but couldn't identify him in the lineup she was given, which was, my brother confirmed, not a real lineup. Aldgate had 1 complaint. It was from a teenager. It had been filed by the teenager's mother and was dismissed within 2 weeks because the mother worked for the county and was quietly informed that continued employment was a nice thing to have. These were not good men who had made a judgment error in a high-pressure situation. These were men who had done this before and been protected, and they believed, correctly, based on all available evidence, that they would be protected again. The internal investigation concluded 3 weeks after the incident. Both deputies were cleared of wrongdoing. The official finding was that Deputy Spence and Deputy Aldgate had responded appropriately to a non-compliant suspect exhibiting signs of impairment. My wife's blood alcohol at the hospital was 0.00. The doctor who recorded it told me quietly, in the hallway, that he had noted it in his records and would testify to that fact if asked. He said this, looking at the floor. I could tell he was a little afraid to say it out loud. I told him I appreciated it. I meant it. Laurel came home 8 days after the incident. Rosie had been staying with my mother-in-law, and when Laurel walked through the door, Rosie ran at her so fast she nearly knocked her down. Laurel caught her with her good arm and held on, and I stood in the kitchen doorway watching them, and I made myself a promise that I kept very quietly inside myself for the next 3 weeks. I went back to base. I had to. I had 9 days left on my rotation, and I finished them. Every day I woke up and did my job and did it the same way I always had, and I called Laurel every evening at 8 p.m. her time, and she told me about her physical therapy and about how Rosie had started drawing again, which she'd stopped doing right after the incident, and about how the school had given her extended medical leave and her colleagues had organized a meal train that had stocked her freezer with enough casseroles to last through February. She didn't tell me she was scared to drive. Her mother told me that. She didn't tell me she'd started waking up at 3 a.m. and sitting in the kitchen until sunrise. Rosie told me that in her own 7-year-old way when she said, "Mommy was up when I woke up in the night and she was just sitting there." I finished my rotation. I got on a plane. I did not tell anyone, not Laurel, not Kane, not Reese, what I was planning to do. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I was precise about it, and precision requires quiet. What I did not do was anything outside the law. I want to be clear about that because there are people who would assume otherwise given my training and given my state of mind. I had 11 years of discipline behind me. I had been in situations where doing the wrong thing would have been very easy and very satisfying, and I had not done the wrong thing because I understood the cost. What I did was this. I contacted the state attorney general's office directly, bypassing the county entirely. I had, through channels I am not going to describe, a direct line to an investigator there named Hartfield who worked special civil rights complaints. I sent Hartfield everything. Kane's research, the hospital records, the gas station dashcam footage we had obtained legally through a records request, the doctor's statement, the prior complaints from Terrence and Gretchen, the mother of the teenager. I had learned in the military that the difference between a successful operation and a failed one is almost never capability. It's preparation. It's patience. It's making sure that when you move, you cannot be undone. Hartfield opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks of receiving my package. At the same time, Kane, with the help of a civil rights attorney named Yolanda from Raleigh, who had been referred to us by Gretchen, who had found us through the prior complaint documents, filed a federal civil rights complaint under Section 1983 against both deputies and Sheriff Beaumont. Beaumont called me, personally, on my cell phone. I don't know how he got the number, but I wasn't surprised. He said, "Son, I think we got off on the wrong foot." I said, "I think so too." He said he wanted to discuss a resolution. He said the department was prepared to offer a settlement. He said the amount would be significant. I said, "I'm not interested in a settlement." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was no longer warm, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I said, "I hope so." He hung up. 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. A man whose voice I didn't recognize told me that I needed to think carefully about the choices I was making, that rural counties had long memories, that my wife still lived in Harker's Mill and still drove on County Road 7. I recorded that call. I sent it to Hartfield within the hour. That recording changed the nature of the investigation considerably. I won't pretend the next 4 months were easy. They weren't. Laurel knew by then what I was doing. I had to tell her after the phone call because it directly affected her safety. And she was frightened. Not of the deputies. Of what might happen to me. She had grown up military adjacent with an uncle who'd served, and she understood what it meant when someone with my background went very, very still and very, very focused. She said to me one night, sitting at the kitchen table after Rosie was in bed, "Promise me this doesn't become something else." I said, "It's already something else. It was something else the moment they put you on the ground." She said, "That's not what I mean, and you know it." I looked at her across the table and I said, "I'm going to do this right. That's the promise." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. She trusted me. That trust was the most important thing in my life, and I was not going to break it by becoming something I couldn't walk back from. The AG investigation concluded 7 months after the incident. Spence and Aldgate were charged with felony assault under color of law, civil rights violations, and filing a false police report. Beaumont was charged with obstruction and abuse of office for his role in suppressing the prior complaints. The trial was held in Raleigh, outside Carteret County, at the request of the prosecution. I testified for 4 hours. Laurel testified for 2. Terrence testified. Gretchen testified. The mother of the teenager testified, and she no longer worked for the county, and she was not afraid. Spence was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 6 years. Aldgate was convicted on 2 of 3 counts. He was sentenced to 4 years. Beaumont pled guilty 3 days before his trial was set to begin. He received a suspended sentence and was permanently barred from law enforcement employment in the state of North Carolina. I was in the courthouse hallway when Beaumont came out after the plea. His lawyer was with him. He looked older than he had when I'd sat across from him in his office. He saw me and stopped walking. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He looked away first. The Sybil case settled the following year, for an amount I will not disclose, other than to say it covered Laurel's medical bills, her lost wages for the year she took off from teaching, because she wasn't ready to be back in a classroom yet, and Rosie's therapy, which she needed and which helped. Yolanda, our attorney, used our case to push through a policy change in the county that required all prior excessive force complaints to be publicly accessible through a records request. 3 other families came forward after the charges were announced. 3 other families who'd been sitting with what happened to them, alone, because they believed no one would listen. I think about that a lot. I think about Terrence, who filed his complaint in 2019 and was told it was closed, and who drove past the spot where it happened every time he went to visit his sister in Beaufort. I think about Gretchen, who couldn't identify the deputy in a rigged lineup and blamed herself for years. I think about that teenager whose mother almost stayed quiet forever because she needed her job. What happened to Laurel was the thing that broke the case open. But it wasn't the beginning of the story. It was just the chapter where someone finally had the resources and the training and the stubbornness to not let it end the way it was supposed to end. Rosie started sleeping without the nightlight in February. She came and told me, like it was news she was proud of. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen while I was making coffee and she said, "Daddy, I slept with the light off last night." I said, "How was it?" She said, "Fine. It was just dark." I didn't say anything for a second because I was doing the thing you do when you're trying not to let your kids see something on your face. I said, "That's great, Bug." She shrugged in the way that 7-year-olds shrug, like it was never a big deal, and went to find her shoes. Laurel was back in her classroom by the following September. She has a new batch of second graders who have no idea what their teacher looked like in a hospital bed in October of the year before, and she has not told them, and she won't. That is hers to carry or set down as she chooses. I went back for my last rotation in the spring. On the morning I left, I stood in the kitchen at 5 a.m. while the house was still dark, and I thought about Beaumont's voice on the phone. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." And I thought about Hartfield reading through that package for the first time. And I thought about Spence being let out of the courtroom. I thought about the promise I made to Laurel. I kept it. That matters to me, not because it makes me better than the situation, but because she needed me to, and keeping promises to the people who trust you is the only kind of strength that means anything when the lights are off and the noise is done. There is a crack in the passenger side mirror of the Subaru. Laurel still hasn't fixed it. I think she keeps it there on purpose now. I think it's the thing she looks at when she passes County Road 7, which she does, because she is not someone who reroutes her life around the places where hard things happened. I've never asked her about it. Some things you understand without asking. I think about the moment Beaumont looked away first in that courthouse hallway. Not because it felt like winning, it didn't, not exactly, but because I understand now what that moment actually was. It was the end of a chain of events that started the second Spence put his boot near my wife and decided no one would do anything about it. He was right about a lot of things. He was right that the county would protect him. He was right that the internal investigation would go nowhere. What he miscalculated was the idea that consequence had already passed him by. It hadn't. It was just still in transit. I've thought about that a lot since everything settled. There's a version of me that comes home from Bagram and breaks things. I know that version of me that comes home from Bagram and breaks things. I know that version exists. I felt him in the hospital room, standing in the doorway looking at Laurel's face. And I made a choice. Not a noble choice. Not a movie choice. Just a practical one. Rage is loud and loud things can be managed. What can't be managed as easily is a man who comes home from 11 years of precision work and decides to be methodical about it. Beaumont's team knew how to handle anger. They didn't have a playbook for patience. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Rosie is 9 now. She sleeps with the light off. She draws horses and soccer fields and occasionally, still, pictures of our family standing in front of her house. And when I look at those drawings, I think about what it costs a child to watch the world be cruel to someone they love, and what it gives them back when they watch that cruelty be answered. Not with more cruelty, but with something harder and quieter and more durable. I am not a perfect man. I made decisions during those 7 months that I second-guessed constantly, that Laurel and I argued about at the kitchen table after Rosie was asleep. There were nights I thought about taking a shorter road. There were mornings I woke up and the short road looked very clean and very direct. What kept me off it wasn't virtue in some abstract sense. It was her face across the table when she said, "Promise me this doesn't become something else." It was understanding that the promise itself was the mission, and that I had never in 11 years compromised a mission for the satisfaction of a moment. What I know now is that the people who hurt Laurel were counting on a specific kind of response. They were counting on either nothing, silence, fear, a family that absorbed the damage and moved on, or something they could use against us. What they were not counting on was someone who had been trained to operate in environments where the obvious move is almost always a trap, and the right move requires waiting longer than feels bearable. Terrence filed his complaint in 2019 and was told it was closed. Gretchen couldn't identify her deputy in a lineup that was designed to fail her. That teenager's mother almost stayed quiet forever. None of them lacked courage. They lacked infrastructure. They lacked someone with the right combination of stubbornness, resources, and the specific kind of clarity that comes from having worked in places where getting it wrong means people die. I don't say that to make myself sound exceptional. I say it because I think about those three people a lot, and I think the difference between their outcomes and mine is not a character difference. It's a resource difference. And that matters. That should bother all of us. Laurel went back to her classroom. Rosie drew a picture last fall of our whole family at the beach, and she gave it to me, rolled up with a rubber band around it. Very official. And I have it on my desk. The crack in the passenger mirror is still there. She still hasn't fixed it. I think she's decided it's not something that needs fixing.